straight, can you?
There was a point there that I was making, but I give up.
Found.
Anyway, it's cool to watch.
It's hard to ignore the reality that the central figure of this entire production, Rachel Zegler, has become one of the most polarizing actresses in Hollywood today. From the very beginning, the reaction to her casting was controversial, not because people didn't want a new Snow White, but because Rachel herself seemed to go out of her way to alienate the very audience Disney was hoping to capture. She presented herself as unapologetically woke, but not in a way that came across as progressive or inspiring. Instead, it felt bitter, self-absorbed, and, to many, almost deranged. This wasn't the case of an actress simply offering her perspective. It was the image of someone who appeared to actively resent the story she had been chosen to lead. Disney, in its eagerness to project modern ideals, overlooked how their decision would be received. They handed the role of one of their most iconic princesses to someone who publicly criticized the original film, mocked its themes, and dismissed its romantic elements as outdated. Rather than honoring the story that millions had cherished for generations, she seemed intent on reinventing it to fit her own personal narrative about feminism, entitlement, and patriarchy. As a result, every word she spoke about the film only served to push audiences further away. Interest in the project wasn't just fading, it was actively being poisoned by its own star. And then came Disney's creative decisions. The choice to remove the 7 dwarfs and replace them with vague, magical creatures was seen not as progress, but as erasure. For decades, Snow White had offered visibility to people with dwarfism. That representation mattered. Seeing multiple actors with dwarfism featured prominently in a blockbuster Disney film was powerful. Instead of leaning into that representation and modernizing the story respectfully, the studio chose to erase it altogether, leaving just a single token dwarf as if to check a box. Critics, audiences, and even actors like Peter Dinklage pointed out the obvious. The move was a step backward. If the story's details felt outdated, the solution was to update the narrative, not erase the very characters that gave the tale its uniqueness. But Rachel's behavior made the backlash even worse. She dismissed criticism with arrogance, telling people who disagreed to simply unfollow her, boasting that she didn't need their support. She portrayed herself as if she were bigger than the film itself, speaking as though her personal beliefs carried more weight than the decades-long legacy of Snow White. Yet the truth is, she was just an actress in the role. She didn't create the character. She didn't write the script. She wasn't directing the movie. And still, she carried herself like she was the sole author of the story, delivering sound bites that audiences found entitled, toxic, and even insulting. As marketing rolled out, things spiraled further. Interviews with Zegler went viral for all the wrong reasons. Her tone came across as combative rather than enthusiastic, and she openly spoke about how Snow White would no longer be saved by a prince, or how the character wasn't a damsel in distress. While these comments might have sounded empowering in theory, they were delivered with such disdain for the original that they alienated longtime fans. Instead of exciting people about a fresh interpretation, she essentially told audiences that the story they loved was worthless. By the time Disney officially unveiled the film, the damage had already been done. When the movie finally reached theaters, reality hit. Despite all of Disney's hype, despite the studio betting on Rachel's millions of online followers, the film's release was met with apathy. Viral videos began circulating online, showing theaters that were empty, screenings with 2 or 3 people at most, and reports of unsold tickets piling up. Entire auditoriums sat in silence, with only a handful of scattered viewers. The internet latched onto this imagery, amplifying the perception that Snow White wasn't just failing, it was collapsing in spectacular fashion. At its core, this fiasco reflected something deeper. Rachel Zegler believed she was redefining Snow White for a modern era, but what audiences saw was someone bitter, unhappy, and unstable, projecting her frustrations with the world onto a fairy tale that never needed saving in the first place. Disney believed her fanbase would guarantee success, but fandom online doesn't always translate into ticket sales. What it did translate into, however, was endless scrutiny, countless memes, and a tidal wave of criticism that completely overshadowed the film itself. The tragedy of it all is that Snow White could have been an opportunity. With thoughtful writing and respect for its legacy, it could have bridged past and present in a meaningful way. Instead, between corporate missteps and the attitude of its star, the remake was doomed before it even touched the box office. Rachel Zegler's name has now become synonymous with the downfall of this project, cementing her reputation as one of Hollywood's most controversial young stars. For many, it wasn't simply that Snow White flopped, it was that the entire ordeal became a symbol of what happens when arrogance, poor decisions, and misplaced priorities collide on the biggest stage possible. It almost feels symbolic that Rachel Zegler has become the image of someone sitting alone in a theater, watching her own movie play to empty seats. That sad picture, mocked endlessly online, captures the fallout perfectly. What should have been her crowning moment as Disney's newest princess turned instead into one of the most embarrassing spectacles Hollywood has seen in years. And now, to make matters worse, even South Park has latched on, with reports that the show is preparing yet another brutal episode targeting Zegler. The writers already roasted her once with their satirical Snow Woke parody, but apparently they believe the saga still has more comedic fuel, and audiences clearly agree. The fact that Rachel has gone from red carpet darling to a recurring punchline on one of television's most savage comedy shows speaks volumes. For an actress still early in her career, being lampooned by South Park isn't just a joke, it's a career scar. The irony is that Rachel was once positioned as Hollywood's next breakout star. After her acclaimed debut in West Side Story, the path ahead looked golden. Landing the role of Snow White should have been the fairy tale turning point, the type of casting that cements someone in cinematic history. Instead, it marked the beginning of a public unraveling. From the very start, the discourse wasn't about the movie, it was about her. Her interviews went viral, not for building excitement, but for tearing apart the legacy of the original. With a smirk, she dismissed the prince as a stalker, claimed Snow White would no longer be a damsel in distress, and promised that her version wouldn't be dreaming of love, but rather of becoming a political leader. To some, those comments sounded like bold modernization. To most, however, they came off as sneering condescension. Rachel wasn't presenting a fresh take, she was ridiculing a beloved classic that had shaped generations. Fans who grew up with Snow White didn't hear passion or respect, they heard contempt. That sentiment quickly spread online. Memes took over. The phrase "girl boss Snow White" began trending, not as praise, but as a mocking summary of what audiences feared the film had become. And then came the ratios. Disney's promotional clips for the film weren't just unpopular, they were historically unpopular. Each trailer, each interview snippet, each behind-the-scenes featurette was swarmed with dislikes and angry comments. Viewers weren't excited about a magical reimagining. They felt lectured, belittled, and alienated by the very actress tasked with selling them on the film. Even Rachel's casual comments turned into ammunition against her, fueling a cycle of backlash that Disney could never escape. The press tour only made things worse. Every red carpet appearance was dissected, every line replayed, and her chemistry, or lack of it, with co-star Gal Gadot became a running joke. At awards shows and promotional events, Gadot's body language looked distant, her smile strained, as though she wished she could vanish into the background. The infamous Oscars moment, where both women shared the stage, left audiences buzzing about the awkward energy. Instead of radiating excitement, Rachel projected bitterness, entitlement, and smugness. All of this overshadowed the actual movie. By the time Snow White hit theaters, the narrative had already been written. This wasn't a beloved fairy tale. Brought to life, it was a soulless corporate project weighed down by controversy and fronted by an actress who seemed to openly despise the material. And audiences responded accordingly. Viral videos showed empty theaters across the country, entire auditoriums with only 2 or 3 scattered viewers. Clips of people filming vacant rows went viral, serving as visual proof of just how catastrophic the box office turnout really was. The imagery was devastating. The collapse of Snow White wasn't simply about a bad remake, it became a cultural flashpoint. For many, Rachel Zegler embodied everything they felt was wrong with modern Hollywood. Self-importance, disdain for tradition, a fixation on politics over storytelling, and a smug belief that audiences would show up regardless. But reality proved otherwise. Online fanbases don't always buy tickets, and arrogance doesn't guarantee box office success. Instead of cementing her as the face of Disney's new era, the film branded her as one of the most unlikable stars working today. Now, as even South Park sharpens its knives for another round of ridicule, Rachel finds herself in the worst possible position.
What's really interesting is that Zegler's fall from grace has been a very satisfying watch for plenty of people.
She's not just dealing with a flop, she's become the flop, the butt of the joke, a cautionary tale in real time. Hollywood's silence has grown louder. Rumors swirl about roles she's lost, projects she's been quietly dropped from, and opportunities that are drying up. For an actress who once looked destined for stardom, it's a breathtaking reversal. The saddest part is that this downfall was avoidable. With humility, grace, and genuine respect for the story, Rachel Zegler could have led a Snow White remake that bridged past and present, tradition and progress. Instead, arrogance, poor choices, and tone-deaf commentary derailed not only the film, but her own trajectory. And now, whether it's empty theaters, viral memes, or satirical takedowns on South Park, the legacy of Rachel's Snow White isn't magic, it's mockery. Visual effects have always been about pushing the boundaries of what is possible, taking us beyond reality and into worlds that feel magical and limitless. That's what audiences expect when they hear the words Disney and Snow White in the same sentence. But when the live-action remake finally hit the stage, something felt off. At the Oscars, Rachel Zegler and Gal Gadot appeared side by side to present an award, yet fans noticed instantly that the chemistry was non-existent. Their interaction was stiff, distant, two people standing together but miles apart. Rumors quickly spread that Gadot had quietly chosen to distance herself from the controversy surrounding her co-star, and that behind the scenes, things weren't exactly warm. Meanwhile, Disney itself stayed oddly silent. There was no major PR strategy, no visible course correction, no attempt to recalibrate the message. It was business as usual, even as the storm clouds gathered. But audiences weren't buying what they were being sold. The classic dwarfs were gone. The prince was erased. The original charm had been stripped away and replaced with a politically reworked narrative that left many fans asking the same question. Was this even Snow White anymore? And when Rachel spoke about it, that question only grew louder. She explained that her Snow White didn't get her name from her skin as white as snow, but rather from surviving a snowstorm, reframing the very identity of the character. She emphasized that fairness wasn't about beauty, but about what lived within your heart, the way you treated others, the way you carried yourself. On paper, it sounded noble, but to audiences who had cherished the original for nearly 90 years, it felt like a lecture. The magic of the fairy tale was being intellectualized into something cold, heavy, and political. What should have been a timeless storybook fantasy had turned into a cultural battlefield. When the film finally debuted, the results were impossible to ignore. Despite Disney's billion-dollar marketing machine and the global recognition of the Snow White name, the box office numbers were disappointing. This wasn't just another underperforming live-action remake, it was one of Disney's most divisive releases ever. Online, the backlash turned into something bigger than bad reviews. South Park announced it would once again satirize Zegler, turning her into a recurring caricature. Memes flooded Twitter, TikTok, and Reddit. And soon, the entire Snow White fiasco wasn't just a failed movie, it was a cultural event. The numbers told their own brutal story. On IMDb, the film crashed to a shocking 1.6 rating, one of the lowest scores in Disney history. Critics weren't just lukewarm, they were scathing. Viewers didn't quietly ignore the film, they actively celebrated its collapse. Threads titled "How Not to Market a Movie" went viral, using Rachel's interviews as case studies in self-sabotage. The failure was commercial, cultural, and personal. And then came the bizarre twist that blurred the line between scandal and parody. A fake OnlyFans account surfaced online, using AI-generated likenesses of Rachel Zegler. It wasn't real, but that didn't matter. People believed it, shared it, and laughed about it. Thousands followed the profile, even joked about it as if it could be her. The fact that so many people found it plausible spoke volumes. Her public image had shifted so dramatically that the idea of her being linked to such a platform no longer seemed absurd. It seemed believable. That's how far her reputation had eroded. In Hollywood, perception is everything. And after Snow White, the perception surrounding Rachel Zegler had changed drastically. She wasn't the breakout star anymore. She wasn't the rising talent with limitless potential. Quietly, casting calls that once had her name at the top began going in other directions. Disney, once eager to frame her as the new face of its next generation of princesses, started to move on. Other studios followed. In an industry that thrives on image and momentum, Rachel's trajectory had gone from meteoric rise to cautionary tale almost overnight. Snow White was meant to cement her place in Hollywood history. Instead, it immortalized her in a very different way. as a symbol of how quickly public favor can collapse, and how even the brightest opportunities can become disasters when arrogance, controversy, and miscalculation collide. Projects that once seemed like a sure thing, rumored roles, tentative offers, and studio-backed opportunities suddenly began to evaporate. Some were quietly delayed, others mysteriously recast, and a few simply faded from conversation altogether. Studio executives never said it outright, but insiders whispered the truth. Rachel Zegler had become a PR liability. What was once marketed as Disney's next golden star had now transformed into a cautionary tale, a reminder of just how quickly Hollywood can turn on you. In the span of a single year, she went from being the face of Disney's future to the poster child for squandered opportunity. The personal toll was no less devastating. Rachel's longtime relationship with Josh Andres Rivera, whom she met during West Side Story, had been one of the few constants in her whirlwind career. Together, they had been painted as one of Hollywood's rising young power couples, often photographed arm in arm on red carpets and praised for their chemistry both on and off screen. But as the Snow White backlash consumed Rachel's life, cracks began to show. Friends close to the couple suggested that the relentless negativity, online harassment, and pressure from the media storm created an emotional strain neither could withstand. By the time the dust began to settle around the film, the relationship had quietly unraveled. For Rachel, the breakup was more than a personal heartbreak. It became another headline, another layer of public scrutiny feeding into the narrative of a young actress unraveling under the spotlight. And then came the blow that no public figure truly escapes once it lands. South Park, the animated juggernaut, infamous for skewering politicians, moguls, and celebrities alike, aired a sequel to their viral Snow White parody. This time, the fictional reboot was titled Snow Woke: The Reimagining, and its star, a thinly veiled caricature named Rachel Z, left little doubt about who they were mocking. The episode showed her rewriting the fairy tale from the ground up, banishing the prince, replacing dwarfs with ethically optimized companions, and delivering self-righteous monologues to a visibly disinterested audience of cartoon townspeople. The satire crescendoed with a meltdown on a late-night talk show, so over the top that even Cartman was left speechless. For most celebrities, being skewered by South Park is not just mockery, it's a cultural milestone, proof that your controversy has crossed into the absurd and cemented itself in pop culture memory. The show doesn't waste time on fleeting scandals. It targets figures whose behavior or image has spiraled so far that parody becomes inevitable. Presidents, tech billionaires, pop icons, they've all been immortalized in the same way. And now, Rachel Zegler was among them. For her, the satire functioned less like a playful jab and more like a televised obituary for the it girl status she once held. Of course, careers can rebound. South Park has taken aim at stars who later reinvented themselves, clawing back public favor after years in the wilderness. But Rachel's road ahead is steeper than most. Between the box office collapse, the meme-worthy interviews, the awkward press tour moments, and the deafening silence now surrounding her name in casting circles, she faces the ultimate test of Hollywood survival. Can she reinvent herself? Can she rebuild her image after being branded as a symbol of arrogance and cultural misfire? Because in Hollywood, perception is currency. And right now, Rachel Zegler's is fractured. Everyone is watching, not to see her next performance, but to see whether she can glue the pieces back together at all.